Hello, everybody, and welcome to Fishery. This is my wife, Laura, and I'm Alexander Williamson, of course, and we are here in Washington along the coastline where every morning we get the beautiful salty mist, and oftentimes there's fog, and it rolls in, and it creates something that you only get for about a half of a mile from the saltwater, only on steep hills, only from Vancouver to Washington State, and it's a very, very unique set of creatures, flora, and fauna. This is the only fish we'll probably be seeing today, but if you like plants, fungi, and other beautiful aspects of nature, I think you'll enjoy this little nature walk we have today.
Welcome to the secret ecosystem of Washington.
Now, at first glimpse, you may think that this is just a normal hill in Washington, but when you look a little closer, all the trees are these beautiful gnarled and twisty Madrone trees that have evolved to actually withstand wind and sandy or clay soil hanging off of hillsides and cliffs. And at the base of them, you get this duff, or actually, this is the living part of the substrate, and it's an inch or two thick, and then below that there can be as much as several feet of peat and moss and debris from the forest and the plants that live here. What's really unique is, if you look closely, we've got all sorts of bladderworts and spleenworts, terrestrial and semi-aquatic mosses, and we also get all sorts of really interesting sundews, carnivorous plants, ferns, and epiphytic plants, as well as really unique lichen that only occur maybe a quarter mile or a half mile from the ocean. Look at this. They're bizarre and otherworldly. And this is an ecosystem that has been largely developed for houses because it's where the best views are. But you get things like this massive moss that's really similar to Christmas moss when it's underwater. And you get these ferns that are like Boston ferns. But let's explore a little more and see some of the other unique plants and fungi that are around here. Now, I got in trouble in my last video a while back talking about the Latin names of the fungi, so we're going to keep it a little more vague, and I apologize. But I assure you, everything shown here, it's for educational purposes, and it's also just to show you the beauty of nature, not really to identify things per se. But you get absolutely fascinating fungi that only live in the very unique spaces that are provided here by that salty morning mist that comes through on cue. You also get these interesting clover-like plants and these really small, almost they look like cryptolatia plants from the aquarium hobby, and they grow all over. And the other thing that you get is this form of algae and lichen. It's a mixture of organisms that live together, and right now you're actually looking at several different species. You can see there's a greenish one, there's a whitish gray one, a scaly kind, and then there's the old man's beard or the staghorn kind, and then there's also a frilly kind. Now, this is not unique. This lichen is not unique here, although there are some lichen species that are unique to the hillsides here in Washington. There's also these very fascinating, bright little fungi that pop up all over, and they exist in a little carpet that's absolutely beautiful when you look at it closely. Colors of purple, dark green, electric yellow. You've got shaggy mosses that look like, untamed dreadlocks. You've got tighter mosses, and then you've got some that look like little pine needle clusters, all living in the same ecosystem. And up here, the reason why this ecosystem doesn't exist much anymore is because these houses sell for $2 to $5 million a piece generally in this area. So even on these steep cliffs, they've kind of gotten rid of this once common ecosystem for the area, and it's only found within a very short stretch. There's lots of life here that you will only find here, including a ton of plants that are just really bizarre. These dark leafed ones growing out of the ground here, and mosses as well. And again, more lichen. Variations very similar to, but when they test the DNA of it, it's completely different, and it's evolved for different habitats than the lichen that you would see in the forest inland in Washington. Look at this absolutely beautiful moss coverage. We'll come take a look over here. I just need to be careful of my footing. And there are non-native, but they've been here for 300 years, rabbits that have made little paths all through here, as well as deer from time to time. And look at this moss. It's an actual moss tapestry that's just draped over this area, and you can see there's flowering bodies which will put out the spores, not in fact flowers. And these are some of the most ancient, groups of plants on earth are the mosses, and as well as things like the lichen. They're also really unique. Here we've got a plant that looks similar to the other ones we've seen, but you can see at the base, the leaves have this flared out shape, almost like a spearhead. And again, more fungi and more moss. It's all just really beautiful, as well as the ferns here. And you can see the little bumps that will become the spores there that will expose later in the year, in the start of the new year, and then the wind will carry them, and little clones of these ferns will spread. Here you see the most common mammal other than humans on this hillside, a rabbit. And these rabbits have been here for 350 years, and they were brought here by the Spanish and dropped off on these islands and peninsulas out here, so that they hoped that when they came back, thinking it was all islands, that they would have a food source for sure. And they dropped them off in the 1780s when first charting this region officially. The Russians, the British, and the Spanish came through here and all tried to lay claim, with the Spanish even going as far as going down to Peru, picking up about 55 Peruvians that they thought resembled the Native Americans here, and dropping them off in an area that today is known as Forks, and telling them to build a fort and hoist the Spanish crown's flag in case any other Europeans came by, so they would think it was already claimed and settled. Now, this whole hillside, you can see it's got this interesting bramble too, and even just 100 yards away from where we were, you get new types of grass, new types of moss, and it all depends on how much morning dew and rain each area gets. But you also find interesting little sundews and plants that only live here, including some fungi that are only found in like a 10-mile stretch along the coast, less than a quarter mile wide. It's really fascinating, and sometimes you need to be 200-300 feet in elevation And that is the only place you will find the specific species that we are seeing that are here and endemic. Now, there's plenty of other species that have made themselves home here when other people try to plant them. But there is something about that salty morning dew that kind of gives an edge to any of the species that evolved for this. So you'll see a Madrone forest, which is something you don't see anywhere else in Washington. You'll see actual whole groves of these Madrone trees, of this moss and peat moss substrate on the ground. So you remember how just a few moments ago we saw the plant with the spearhead base? Well, there's another type that only has half of that shape. And there's also another kind where that spearhead shape points down, the little flares at the tail. And you can find them side by side, but you'll find that one is far more common than the other. And I don't personally know whether that's just a morphology and one is taking over more commonly than the other, or what exactly is going on. But they turn this beautiful red and gold color as it turns to winter. Some of them do. Others stay exactly as they are, and it's kind of a mystery to me why each does what it does. And I've always found the few areas that still exist like this to be absolutely beautiful and fascinating in the life forms that are all over the ground. Almost looks something, you'd imagine to be prehistoric. Here we have a south-facing slope, and the way that the plants cope with more sunlight, even it being winter, and the northwest when the sun's setting at 4:30 p.m. The way they cope with that is by the colors in the leaves. They create different color spectrums and different densities of the different pigments in the plant. And that allows different wavelengths of light to be utilized differently. So they can utilize the dimmer wavelengths of light or the brighter wavelengths of light. And you'll see that plants that look almost identical have actually adapted extremely differently side by side, right in the same small area. So here we have one of the beautiful Madrone, or Madrona as we call them around here usually, Madrone trees. And there are several species, but the one that's most common around here is absolutely fascinating. The wood is very similar to like a manzanita, which is known in aquascaping pretty well. But here you can see the different shapes it takes just naturally. And the bark peels off, and in the summer, the bark actually is full of water. So if there's ever a drought, the Native Americans and the early settlers would wring it out, and they'd have essentially fresh water. Also, the trees are fire resistant, and so when there'd be forest fires that would sweep through the areas along the hillsides of the water here, or where lightning would strike on the high point off the water, they would burn through the underbrush, yet these trees would continue to thrive and resist it. Now, another thing about these trees is they have these beautiful red berries, and steelhead salmon love eating them. And the Native Americans and early settlers also used madrone berries for catching them. You can see the spiraling of this wood. It makes for a very interesting piece of wood for furniture or other uses. And it's a fairly hard wood, actually, that grows pretty tightly. You can see that the rings on the tree are not very far apart for each year. They're fairly tight, although you can see that there are spaces in years where there were droughts. Now, if you eat too many of the berries, which they would make into cider, and also they would pound into a type of kind of like a preserved fruit roll-up, the natives would, and if you eat too much of it, you'll get a stomach ache. However, the bark can be brewed and boiled into a tea, and that tea will cure the stomach ache, which is kind of an interesting little thing where the plant itself has the ability to fix the side effects from eating too much of the other part of the plant. Now, another little interesting tidbit is that the earliest settlers and the natives, soon after they noticed the settlers doing it, would take these trees, and because it is a fairly hard wood, they would put them into barrels or containers, and without oxygen in them, they'd build these big strong fires around them, and they'd make charcoal. Well, that charcoal was then used to make gunpowder when they couldn't get supplies and reinforcements, because this area was so remote back then, and there was no Panama Canal at that time either. But just look at these beautiful structures. I've used them in aquascaping and they turn out great. And this tree is also full of tannins, as are the berries and the leaves. A tree that's becoming more rare as these micro ecosystems are taken over by houses. Yet another fascinating plant we find here. It is absolutely tiny. All these plants that have such elaborate structures to them are absolutely tiny in this ecosystem, short of the Madrone, and aka Madrone trees, and the brush that grows on the hillsides, of which there are only 2 or 3 species that grow, and then of the grass there are about 3 or 4 species that grow. When you get into the grass, you'll also see different species of these plantain type plants also, that are larger versions of the small ones we see up the hill where the nutrients is lacking. Alright, you guys, thank you so much for joining us on this Christmas Eve, exploring this secret ecosystem along the Salish Sea. We'll see you next time. Goodbye, and
Happy holidays!